Murder by starvation. The 5-year plan causes famine in the breadbasket, the Soviet Union. At the end of 1932, Stalin proudly announced that the 5-year plan had been completed a year ahead of schedule. The achievements were astonishing. Factories produced 4 times as much as they had in 1928. Tractors, tanks, and airplanes rolled off newly constructed assembly lines. Nearly 12 million new laborers had been put to work. Stalin had created an industrial powerhouse, and he had done it in just 4 years. The statistics, however, concealed the dark secret. While Stalin exported vast amounts of grain to pay for his new factories, millions of people in the grain-growing heartland of the Soviet Union were starving to death. The 5-year plan had created one of the worst famines in human history, right in the middle of the country's most productive farmland. Stalin had long been suspicious of the peasantry, especially those who occupied the fertile regions of Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. Peasants had stubbornly resisted the Red Army's attempts to draft recruits and seize supplies during the Civil War. They had rebelled against the demands of war communism. Now they were standing in the way of Stalin's plan to modernize the Soviet Union. When collectivization began in 1928, peasants clung stubbornly to their private farms. Stalin fought back with equal persistence and much greater force. Nearly 1 million defiant kulaks were deported to gulags in Siberia. Party officials invaded the countryside to seize grain and livestock from private farmers at gunpoint. The officials took not only food, but much of the seed needed to sow crops for the coming year. Pavlo Solotko was 10 in 1932 when his family began to feel the strain. His parents had refused to join a collective, and party workers kept returning to the family's farm to demand higher and higher quotas of grain. "We kept some grain in order for our family to survive the winter," he recalled, "but the brigades were walking around our farm and snooping, and gradually took away everything to the last grain." In winter of 1932 to 1933, the first signs of a growing disaster emerged. Officials in the provinces of Kiev and Vinnytsia reported food shortages and hunger on a massive scale. Hospitals were clogged with cases of malnutrition. In the fields, peasants were dropping dead of starvation. By the spring, a terrible famine had spread across the countryside. People swarmed train stations, hoping to find food in the cities. When they arrived, they found no relief. Food was strictly rationed, and lines at government supply stations stretched for blocks. Peasants resorted to desperate measures to feed themselves and their children. They caught mice, rats, sparrows, ants, and earthworms, reported the writer, Vasily Grossman. They ground up bones into flour, and when the grass came up, they began to dig up roots and eat the leaves and buds. They used everything there was. When parents could no longer find anything to eat, they left their children on street corners in the hope that someone would take them in and feed them. Reports of cannibalism leaked out from the worst affected regions. In the city of Poltava, children started mysteriously disappearing from the streets. Before long, fresh supplies of meat appeared in the normally barren city markets. Upon inspection, the meat was found to be human flesh. 2 famine victims lie on a sidewalk in Kharkov, Ukraine. Several million people died during Stalin's forced collectivization campaign. Stalin called stories of the peasants' suffering fables. As people struggled to survive, they found that they had few options. Stalin closed Ukraine's borders in January 1933, so no one could flee in search of food. He also made sure that theft was not an option. By Stalin's own decree, anyone caught stealing so much as 5 ears of corn from a collective could be put to death. His agents even inspected people's feces for signs that they were illegally consuming grain. Even at the cost of millions of lives, Stalin was determined to stick to his economic plan. In the midst of the famine, precious food flowed out of the Soviet Union by the shipload. Village dairies in Ukraine churned butter and packed it for export, while starving people waited in breadlines down the street. In 1932 and 1933, the worst years of the famine, the Soviet Union collected nearly 30 million tons of grain from peasants and sold it overseas. By the end of 1933, the Soviet countryside had been devastated. Once lively villages had become ghost towns with skeleton-thin corpses lining the streets. At least 3 million people had died of starvation and disease. Millions more suffered in the gulags, in Siberian exile, or on collective farms. In Stalin's time, few people understood the extent of the disaster. Stalin banned journalists and other writers from publishing accounts of the famine. Today, Ukrainians remember the famine as the Holodomor, or murder by starvation. Many people believe that Stalin not only allowed it to happen, but deliberately caused the disaster in order to wipe out Ukrainian resistance to communist rule.